They arrived at Ellis Island, clutching worn steerage tickets and weathered satchels, eyes bright with dreams of prosperity in the new world. Yet some would carve their names into American history, not with honest labor or entrepreneurial success, but with acts of such calculated malevolence that entire communities would shudder at the mention of their foreign accents. Today we delve into 4 chilling cases from the 19th century where immigrants brought darkness to American soil. The gaslight flickered against the grimy windows of Mrs. Catherine O'Brien's boarding house on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan as the autumn of 1847 settled over New York City like a burial shroud. Among her tenants was a peculiar gentleman who had arrived from Ireland just 6 months prior, speaking in the refined accent of County Cork and carrying letters of recommendation that vouched for his character as a former groundskeeper on a grand estate. Seamus O'Malley presented himself as a man of modest means but impeccable breeding, always tipping his worn bowler hat to the ladies and speaking in the gentle, measured tones of someone accustomed to serving his betters. He paid his rent promptly each Friday evening, attended Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral without fail, and had earned the trust of his fellow Irish immigrants who saw in him a representation of the respectability they all hoped to achieve in America. What the residents of Mrs. O'Brien's establishment could not have known was that Seamus O'Malley had fled Ireland, not because of the devastating potato famine that was driving so many of his countrymen to American shores, but because he had left behind a trail of missing children in the villages surrounding Cork. The authorities there had never gathered sufficient evidence to arrest him, but whispered rumors and the suspicious glances of neighbors had made his continued residence in the old country impossible. In New York, Seamus had initially restrained his darker impulses, focusing instead on establishing himself as a trustworthy member of the immigrant community. He found employment as a porter at the Fulton Fish Market, where his strength and reliability made him valuable to the wholesale merchants who needed their goods, moved quickly and safely through the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan. But as the harsh winter of 1847 gave way to spring, Seamus began to notice the abundance of children who roamed the streets of Five Points with minimal supervision. These were the sons and daughters of Irish and German immigrants who worked long hours in factories and tenements, leaving their offspring to fend for themselves in a city that offered countless opportunities for a child to disappear without trace. His first victim was a 7-year-old boy named Patrick Murphy, whose mother worked 16 hours a day in a textile mill and whose father had died crossing the Atlantic during the terrible voyage that brought them to America. Patrick was bright and curious, with the kind of trusting nature that made him willing to follow a kindly adult who promised him candy or a warm meal. Seamus encountered Patrick on a rainy Thursday evening in May, when the boy was huddled in a doorway on Baxter Street, waiting for his mother to return from work. The child was hungry and cold, and when Seamus offered to take him to Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house for a bowl of hot stew, Patrick accepted gratefully, seeing in the well-dressed gentleman a figure of authority and kindness. Mrs. O'Brien would later remember that Seamus had brought the boy to the boarding house that evening, explaining that he had found the child lost and crying on the street. She prepared a meal for Patrick and assumed that Seamus would help the boy find his way home once he had eaten and warmed himself by the fire. What she did not see was Seamus administering a small dose of laudanum to the boy's milk, a substance that would render Patrick docile and compliant. When Patrick's mother, Bridget Murphy, returned from the textile mill that night, she found their one-room apartment empty. She searched the neighborhood frantically, asking everyone she encountered if they had seen her son, but no one could provide any useful information. In a community where children frequently disappeared due to accidents, disease, or simply running away to seek better fortunes elsewhere, one missing boy did not attract the attention of the overwhelmed authorities. Seamus had taken Patrick to a basement storage room in an abandoned warehouse near the East River, a location he had prepared carefully over several weeks. The room was soundproofed with heavy canvas and stocked with supplies that would allow him to keep a victim alive for an extended period. His intentions were not merely to kill the boy quickly, but to subject him to prolonged torture that would satisfy the dark compulsions that had driven him from Ireland. For 3 days, Patrick Murphy endured unspeakable torment at the hands of Seamus O'Malley. The details of what occurred in that basement chamber are too horrific to recount in full, but police reports from the eventual investigation would describe evidence of systematic torture that demonstrated both sadistic creativity and medical knowledge that suggested Seamus had some background in anatomy or surgery. When Seamus finally ended Patrick's suffering, he disposed of the body by weighting it with chains and dumping it into the East River during the pre-dawn hours when the docks were deserted. He cleaned the basement room meticulously and returned to Mrs. O'Brien's boarding house, where he resumed his normal routine as if nothing had happened. Over the next 18 months, 4 more children would disappear from the streets of Lower Manhattan, all of them sharing certain characteristics that had attracted Seamus's attention. They were all between the ages of 6 and 10, all from families where parental supervision was minimal due to economic necessity, and all possessed the kind of innocent trust that made them easy to lure away from safety. The disappearances might have continued indefinitely, if not for the keen observation of Father Michael Flanagan, the priest at St. Patrick's Cathedral, who had noticed that Seamus often asked detailed questions about families with young children. Father Flanagan had initially assumed that Seamus was simply showing Christian concern for the welfare of his fellow parishioners, but as more children vanished, the priest began to suspect a more sinister motive. The breakthrough came when Father Flanagan decided to follow Seamus after Sunday Mass in October of 1849. The priest watched from a distance as Seamus approached a young girl named Mary Kelly, who was playing alone outside a tenement building on Mott Street. Father Flanagan intervened before Seamus could lure the child away. But his confrontation with the man revealed a glimpse of the murderous rage that lurked beneath Seamus's carefully constructed facade of respectability. When Father Flanagan reported his suspicions to the police, Detective Thomas Walsh of the Metropolitan Police began an investigation that quickly uncovered evidence linking Seamus to the missing children. A search of the abandoned warehouse where Seamus had constructed his torture chamber revealed enough physical evidence to confirm the worst fears of the investigators. Seamus O'Malley was arrested on November 2, 1849, but he maintained his innocence throughout the interrogation and trial that followed. The evidence against him was overwhelming, however, and he was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. On the morning of his execution, February 15, 1850, Seamus finally confessed to his crimes, revealing details that confirmed he had indeed been responsible for similar atrocities in Ireland before fleeing to America. The O'Malley case sent shockwaves through New York's Irish immigrant community, where residents realized that their trust in a fellow countryman had enabled a monster to prey upon their children. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of immigrant families, whose economic desperation often forced them to leave their children unprotected while they worked to survive in their new homeland. Our second case takes us to the bustling industrial city of Pittsburgh in the summer of 1863, where the demands of the Civil War had created unprecedented opportunities for skilled craftsmen willing to work long hours in the foundries and machine shops that supplied the Union Army with weapons and equipment. Among those who answered the call for workers was a soft-spoken German immigrant named Heinrich Zimmermann, who claimed to have learned precision metalworking in the renowned workshops of Nuremberg before political turmoil forced him to seek his fortune in America. Heinrich impressed his supervisors at the Allegheny Arsenal with his attention to detail and his ability to fabricate complex mechanical components with remarkable accuracy. Heinrich was a model employee who worked overtime without complaint and demonstrated genuine concern for the safety and well-being of his fellow workers. He lived in a modest boarding house near the arsenal and spent his evenings reading technical journals and practicing English with other German immigrants who had found employment in Pittsburgh's booming war industries. What Heinrich's colleagues did not know was that his expertise in metalworking had been acquired not in legitimate workshops, but in the basement laboratory where he had conducted horrific experiments on human subjects. He had fled Germany not because of political persecution, but because authorities in Bavaria had begun investigating a series of disappearances involving young women who had been seen in Heinrich's company shortly before they vanished. Heinrich had always been fascinated by the mechanics of death, particularly the ways in which the human body responded to various forms of trauma and torture. In Germany, he had perfected techniques for keeping victims alive for extended periods while subjecting them to progressively more severe injuries, always documenting his procedures with the methodical precision of a scientist conducting legitimate research. In Pittsburgh, Heinrich initially focused on establishing himself as a valuable member of the community while he searched for appropriate subjects for his experiments. He was particularly interested in young women who worked in the textile mills and other industries that employed female labor, reasoning that their disappearances would be more likely to be attributed to workplace accidents or voluntary departures to seek employment elsewhere. His first victim in Pittsburgh was an 18-year-old mill worker named Anna Schmidt, a fellow German immigrant who had arrived in America with her elderly parents and was working to support the family while her father recovered from an injury sustained during their voyage across the Atlantic. Anna was diligent and hard-working, but she was also isolated from the larger German community because her family's poverty prevented them from participating in social activities. Heinrich cultivated Anna's friendship over several months, presenting himself as a successful compatriot who wanted to help fellow Germans adjust to life in America. He offered to teach her better English and to introduce her to potential employers who might offer higher wages than she was earning at the textile mill. Anna was grateful for his attention and came to regard him as an older brother figure who genuinely cared about her welfare. On the evening of August 23, 1863, Heinrich invited Anna to accompany him to what he claimed was a social gathering for German immigrants at a private residence in Allegheny City. He explained that the event would provide her with opportunities to meet eligible young men and potential employers who could help advance her prospects in Pittsburgh's German community. Anna was excited about the invitation because she had been feeling increasingly lonely and isolated in her new country. She spent her meager savings on a new dress for the occasion and arranged for a neighbor to check on her parents while she was away. When Heinrich arrived to escort her to the supposed social gathering, she was eager and optimistic about the evening ahead. Heinrich's actual destination was a basement workshop he had constructed beneath an abandoned brewery on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. He had spent months preparing the space, installing specialized equipment that would allow him to conduct his experiments without the risk of detection. The workshop was soundproofed with heavy timber and equipped with surgical instruments, restraining devices, and detailed charts that documented the procedures he planned to perform on his victims. Anna realized something was wrong when Heinrich led her into the dark basement instead of the well-lit social hall she had expected to find. By then, it was too late to escape, as Heinrich was far stronger than she appeared and had come prepared with restraints and drugs that would render her helpless. For the next 5 days, Anna Schmidt endured torture that combined Heinrich's technical expertise with his sadistic creativity. Heinrich documented every aspect of Anna's suffering in detailed journals that revealed his systematic approach to inflicting maximum pain while keeping his victim alive as long as possible. He tested various instruments and techniques, recording the physiological responses he observed and noting refinements that might improve his methods in future experiments. When Anna finally succumbed to her injuries, Heinrich disposed of her body in the Monongahela River, weighted with scrap metal from the arsenal where he worked. He cleaned his workshop thoroughly and returned to his normal routine, already planning his next experiment and identifying potential victims among the vulnerable immigrant women who worked in Pittsburgh's mills and factories. Over the next 2 years, 6 more young women would disappear from Pittsburgh's German immigrant community, all of them sharing characteristics that had attracted Heinrich's attention. They were all isolated from family or community support networks, all employed in industries where employee turnover was high, and all trusting enough to accept Heinrich's offers of assistance or friendship. The pattern of disappearances was finally noticed by Detective James McBride of the Pittsburgh Police, who had begun investigating reports from German families about missing daughters and sisters. McBride observed that several of the missing women had been seen in the company of a well-dressed German man shortly before they vanished, and witnesses provided descriptions that consistently matched Heinrich's appearance. The investigation gained momentum when McBride discovered that Heinrich had access to the abandoned brewery where he had constructed his workshop. A search of the premises revealed evidence of the systematic torture and murder of multiple victims, along with Heinrich's detailed journals that documented his crimes with scientific precision. Heinrich Zimmermann was arrested on September 7, 1865, but he showed no remorse for his actions and seemed genuinely puzzled by the moral outrage his crimes had provoked. During his trial, he explained his murders as scientific experiments designed to advance human knowledge about pain and death, displaying the same calm professionalism that had made him valuable to his employers at the arsenal. Heinrich was convicted and sentenced to death, but he continued his experiments until the very end, using his final weeks in prison to document his observations about the psychological effects of impending execution. He was hanged on December 20th, 1865, taking with him secrets about the full extent of his crimes that investigators would never fully uncover. The Zimmermann case horrified Pittsburgh's German immigrant community and led to increased scrutiny of all foreign-born residents suspected of criminal behavior. The methodical nature of Heinrich's crimes and his apparent lack of conscience challenged prevailing assumptions about the relationship between education and morality, raising troubling questions about the kinds of people America was welcoming to its shores. Our third case transports us to the cattle town of Abilene, Kansas, in the spring of 1871, where the completion of the Kansas Pacific Railroad had created a booming economy built around shipping Texas Longhorns to eastern markets. Among the colorful characters attracted to this frontier settlement was a mysterious Frenchman who called himself Jean-Baptiste Moreau and claimed to have been a professional gambler in New Orleans before seeking his fortune in the cattle trade. Jean-Baptiste was an elegant figure who dressed in fine clothes and spoke perfect English with just enough of a French accent to add an exotic charm to his personality. He was a skilled card player and a witty conversationalist who quickly became a popular figure in Abilene saloons and gambling halls. Even the town's more respectable citizens found him engaging, and he was frequently invited to social events, where his old-world manners and fascinating stories made him a welcome guest. What the residents of Abilene could not have known was that Jean-Baptiste Moreau was actually Louis Beauregard, a man who had fled Louisiana after being suspected in a series of brutal murders that had terrorized New Orleans during the final years of the Civil War. He had assumed his new identity while traveling westward, carefully constructing a background that would allow him to integrate seamlessly into frontier society. In New Orleans, Louis had developed a particular fascination with the rituals and practices of voodoo, not out of religious belief, but because he had discovered that the fear and superstition surrounding these traditions provided excellent cover for his murderous activities. He had learned to exploit the terror that voodoo inspired in both black and white communities, using occult symbolism to transform his crimes into something that seemed supernatural rather than merely criminal. In Abilene, Jean-Baptiste initially restrained his darker impulses, while he established himself in the community and studied the local population for suitable victims. He was particularly interested in the prostitutes who serviced the cowboys and railroad workers, reasoning that their disappearances would be less likely to prompt serious investigation by law enforcement officials who regarded such women as expendable. His first victim in Abilene was a 25-year-old woman named Sarah Jenkins, who worked at the Bull's Head Saloon and provided companionship to travelers passing through town. Sarah was originally from Missouri and had come to Abilene seeking independence and economic opportunity in a place where a woman could earn decent wages without facing the social restrictions that limited her options in more settled communities. Jean-Baptiste courted Sarah for several weeks, presenting himself as a sophisticated gentleman who treated her with the kind of respect she rarely encountered from other men. He spoke to her about his plans to invest in cattle ranching and hinted that he might be interested in marriage if he could find the right woman to share his future prosperity. Sarah was charmed by his attention and began to envision a life of respectability as the wife of a successful businessman. On the night of June 15, 1871, Jean-Baptiste invited Sarah to accompany him to a supposedly abandoned homestead outside town, where he claimed to be considering purchasing land for a ranch. He explained that he wanted her opinion on the property's suitability and promised that they would return to Abilene before dawn so that she would not miss work the following day. Sarah was excited about the prospect of helping Jean-Baptiste make important business decisions and saw the invitation as evidence that he was serious about their relationship. She dressed carefully for the occasion and brought a picnic basket filled with food and wine, imagining a romantic evening under the stars with the man she hoped to marry. Jean-Baptiste's actual destination was indeed an abandoned homestead, but he had chosen the location not for its ranching potential, but because its isolation would allow him to conduct the kind of ritualistic murder that had characterized his crimes in New Orleans. He had spent weeks preparing the site, gathering materials, and constructing an altar where he planned to perform a ceremony that combined elements of voodoo practice with his own sadistic innovations. When they arrived at the homestead, Sarah initially assumed that Jean-Baptiste's talk of voodoo rituals and blood sacrifice was merely an attempt to frighten her as part of some elaborate seduction game. She laughed at his dramatic gestures and mock-serious incantations, not realizing that his intentions were entirely genuine until it was too late to escape or call for help. The murder of Sarah Jenkins was accomplished with theatrical flair that transformed the crime into a grotesque performance. Jean-Baptiste had choreographed every aspect of the ritual, from the preliminary ceremonies that were designed to terrify his victim to the final sacrifice that ended her life. He documented the entire proceeding in a journal written in a mixture of French and English, describing his actions as religious observances rather than criminal acts. After disposing of Sarah's body in a deep well on the abandoned property, Jean-Baptiste returned to Abilene and resumed his normal activities as if nothing had happened. He expressed concern about Sarah's disappearance when other residents of the Bull's Head Saloon began asking about her whereabouts, and he even offered to help organize a search party to look for the missing woman. Over the next 18 months, 4 more women would disappear from Abilene, all of them sharing characteristics that had attracted Jean-Baptiste's attention. They were all employed in occupations that placed them outside the protection of respectable society, all isolated from family networks that might demand thorough investigation of their disappearances, and all trusting enough to accompany Jean-Baptiste to remote locations where they could be murdered without witnesses. The pattern of disappearances was finally recognized by Marshal Tom Smith, who had been hired by Abilene City Council to bring law and order to the booming cattle town. Smith observed that several missing women had been seen in Jean-Baptiste's company shortly before they vanished, and he began investigating the mysterious Frenchman's background and activities. Marshal Smith's investigation revealed inconsistencies in Jean-Baptiste's story about his past and evidence that he had been present at locations where bodies or personal effects of missing women had been discovered. A search of Jean-Baptiste's hotel room uncovered journals describing ritualistic murders and occult paraphernalia that had been used in the crimes. The breakthrough came when Marshal Smith located the abandoned homestead where Jean-Baptiste had conducted his first murder in Abilene. The well on the property yielded the remains of multiple victims, along with evidence of the elaborate ceremonies that had preceded their deaths. The ritualistic nature of the crimes shocked even hardened frontier lawmen who had seen every form of violence that the American West could produce. Jean-Baptiste Moreau was arrested on October 31st, 1872, but he showed no remorse for his actions and seemed to regard his crimes as religious experiences rather than murders. During his trial, he explained his actions as necessary sacrifices to spiritual forces that demanded blood in exchange for earthly success and power. The evidence against Jean-Baptiste was overwhelming, and he was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. However, he managed to escape from the Abilene jail on the night before his scheduled execution, killing 2 guards in the process and vanishing into the vast expanse of the American frontier. Despite an extensive manhunt that extended across multiple states and territories, Jean-Baptiste Moreau was never recaptured. Some investigators believed he had fled to Mexico or returned to Louisiana under another assumed identity, while others suspected he had been killed by vigilantes or died in the wilderness. Reports of similar ritualistic murders surfaced periodically in various frontier towns, but none could be definitively linked to the escaped killer. The Moreau case had a lasting impact on Abilene and other cattle towns, where residents became more suspicious of strangers who claimed exotic backgrounds or possessed unusual knowledge about foreign customs. The ritualistic nature of the murders also contributed to a growing fear of foreign religious practices and occult beliefs that would influence American attitudes toward immigration for decades to come. Our final case brings us to the fog-shrouded streets of San Francisco in the winter of 1889, where the city's booming economy was attracting fortune seekers from around the world. Among those drawn to California's opportunities was a reserved Italian man named Giuseppe Benedetto, who claimed to have been a merchant in Naples before deciding to try his luck in America's most cosmopolitan western city. Giuseppe possessed the refined manners and cultural sophistication that made him welcome in San Francisco's growing Italian community, where successful immigrants took pride in maintaining the traditions and values of their homeland. He found employment as a translator and business agent, helping newly arrived Italians navigate the complex legal and financial requirements of establishing themselves in American commerce. Giuseppe's apparent devotion to helping his fellow countrymen made him a respected figure in Little Italy, where he was frequently called upon to mediate disputes and provide advice on everything from business partnerships to marriage arrangements. Father Antonio Rossi of Saints Peter and Paul Church praised Giuseppe as an example of the kind of educated, principled immigrant who brought honor to the Italian name in America. What Giuseppe's admirers did not know was that he had fled Italy, not to seek economic opportunity, but to escape prosecution for his involvement in a secret society that had committed a series of ritual murders in the Naples area. Giuseppe had been a member of a criminal organization that combined elements of traditional mafia activity with occult practices derived from ancient Mediterranean cults that predated Christianity. In San Francisco, Giuseppe initially focused on establishing his reputation and building a network of contacts that would be useful for both legitimate business and criminal activities. He was particularly interested in identifying wealthy Italian families whose success might make them targets for extortion or whose isolation from broader American society might make them vulnerable to more direct forms of attack. Giuseppe's first victim in San Francisco was Salvatore Torino, a prosperous wine merchant who had built a successful business importing Italian vintages for the city's growing population of affluent immigrants. Salvatore lived with his wife Maria and their 2 young children in a comfortable house in North Beach, where he was regarded as a pillar of the Italian community and a generous supporter of charitable causes. Giuseppe had cultivated Salvatore's friendship over several months, presenting himself as a potential business partner who possessed valuable contacts in Italian wine-producing regions. He convinced Salvatore that they could greatly expand the wine importing business by working together, and he provided detailed information about vintages and suppliers that demonstrated impressive knowledge of the Italian wine trade. The two men had been meeting regularly to discuss their proposed business partnership, and Giuseppe had gained Salvatore's complete trust by providing him with genuine business advice that resulted in profitable transactions. Salvatore came to regard Giuseppe as both a friend and a mentor, whose sophisticated understanding of international commerce could help elevate his business to new levels of success. On the evening of December 13th, 1889, Giuseppe invited Salvatore to accompany him to a warehouse in the Mission district, where he claimed to have stored several cases of rare Italian wines that he wanted to show his prospective partner. Giuseppe explained that the wines were samples from a vineyard in Tuscany that was offering exclusive distribution rights to American importers, and he suggested that examining these particular bottles would help them determine whether to pursue this potentially lucrative opportunity. Salvatore was eager to see the wines Giuseppe had described, particularly since their business discussions had convinced him that his new partner possessed access to suppliers and products that could transform his modest importing operation into a major commercial enterprise. He arranged for his wife to manage the shop while he was away and promised to return home with detailed information about the new wine varieties they might add to their inventory. Giuseppe's warehouse was indeed stocked with wine casks and bottles, but these were merely props designed to maintain the illusion of legitimacy until he could overpower his victim and begin the ritualistic murder he had planned with meticulous care. The warehouse had been modified to serve as a ceremonial chamber where Giuseppe could perform the kind of occult ritual that had characterized his crimes in Italy. When Salvatore realized that Giuseppe's intentions were murderous rather than commercial, it was too late for him to escape or defend himself effectively. Giuseppe had prepared restraints and weapons that allowed him to subdue his victim quickly and efficiently, and he had arranged the warehouse space to muffle any sounds that might attract the attention of potential witnesses. The murder of Salvatore Torino was conducted according to ritualistic procedures that Giuseppe had learned during his involvement with criminal organizations in Italy. The ceremony included symbolic elements designed to transfer Salvatore's business success and social position to Giuseppe, who believed that murdering successful Italian immigrants would somehow enhance his own prospects in American society. Giuseppe documented the ritual murder in detailed journals, written in a combination of Italian dialects and Latin phrases, describing the ceremony as a religious observance that honored ancient gods who demanded blood sacrifice in exchange for worldly power and prosperity. After completing the murder, he disposed of Salvatore's body by dissolving it in acid, a method he had learned from criminal associates in Naples who specialized in making victims disappear without trace. When Salvatore failed to return home that evening, his wife Maria became increasingly worried and began searching for him throughout the Italian community. Giuseppe expressed appropriate concern about his missing friend and offered to help organize efforts to locate him, all while maintaining the pretense that their business meeting had concluded normally and that Salvatore had left the warehouse in good spirits. Over the next 2 years, 3 more prominent Italian immigrants would disappear from San Francisco, all of them successful businessmen who had been seen in Giuseppe's company shortly before they vanished. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Giuseppe would cultivate the victim's friendship and trust, arrange a private meeting at a remote location, and then conduct a ritualistic murder followed by complete disposal of the body. The investigation into these disappearances was hampered by the reluctance of many Italian immigrants to cooperate with American law enforcement officials, whom they viewed with suspicion based on their experiences with corrupt authorities in their homeland. Giuseppe exploited this mistrust by positioning himself as a protector of Italian interests who could shield the community from unwanted police attention. Detective Patrick O'Sullivan of the San Francisco Police Department finally broke the case when he discovered that Giuseppe had been using the identities and business credentials of his murder victims to conduct fraudulent transactions. A thorough investigation of Giuseppe's financial records revealed evidence linking him to all of the missing businessmen and uncovered the warehouse where he had conducted his crimes. The warehouse yielded horrific evidence of systematic torture and murder, including journals that documented Giuseppe's ritualistic procedures and occult beliefs. The journals revealed that Giuseppe believed himself to be continuing ancient traditions that granted him the right to kill successful members of his own ethnic community in order to absorb their prosperity and social position. Giuseppe Benedetto was arrested on March 22, 1892, but he maintained throughout his interrogation and trial that his actions were religiously motivated rather than criminal. He claimed to be a priest of an ancient Mediterranean cult that predated both Christianity and the Roman Empire, and he insisted that his murders were necessary sacrifices that honored gods who had been worshipped in Italy for thousands of years. Despite Giuseppe's claims about religious motivation, he was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. The trial revealed the existence of criminal organizations in Italy that combined traditional organized crime activities with occult practices. Information that shocked American authorities who had not previously understood the complexity and sophistication of some European criminal enterprises. Giuseppe was executed by hanging on September 8, 1893, but his case had lasting effects on American attitudes toward Italian immigration and on law enforcement approaches to investigating crimes involving foreign criminal organizations. The ritualistic nature of his murders and his claims about ancient religious traditions contributed to growing suspicions about the cultural and religious practices that European immigrants brought to American shores. These four macabre cases from the 19th century demonstrate how the promise of opportunity and freedom in America could attract not only honest immigrants seeking better lives, but also predators who used the anonymity and mobility of frontier society to continue criminal careers that had been disrupted in their homelands. Each of these men exploited the trust and solidarity of their own ethnic communities, using shared language, culture, and religion as weapons against fellow immigrants who had welcomed them as compatriots and friends. The cases also revealed the limitations of 19th century law enforcement in dealing with criminals who possessed international backgrounds and sophisticated knowledge of methods for concealing their crimes. The lack of communication between American authorities and their counterparts in Europe made it possible for dangerous individuals to escape justice simply by crossing the Atlantic and assuming new identities in communities that had no way of verifying their backgrounds or detecting their criminal histories. Perhaps most disturbing is the ritualistic nature of many of these crimes, which combined traditional criminal violence with elements of religious or occult practice that transformed murder into something that seemed to possess supernatural significance. These cases contributed to a growing American suspicion of foreign religious and cultural practices, particularly those that seemed to conflict with Protestant Christian values and democratic political principles. The victims of these crimes were not merely individuals who lost their lives, but entire immigrant communities that lost their sense of security and mutual trust. The knowledge that predators could disguise themselves as fellow countrymen seeking refuge from poverty and persecution created lasting trauma that influenced how immigrant groups related to newcomers from their homelands. The legacy of these cases extended far beyond their immediate impact on the communities where they occurred. They became part of a growing body of evidence that some Americans used to justify restrictions on immigration and to argue that the country's traditional policy of welcoming foreign-born residents needed to be reconsidered in light of the dangers that some immigrants posed to public safety. Yet these cases also demonstrate the resilience and adaptability of American institutions in confronting new forms of criminal behavior. Law enforcement agencies gradually developed more sophisticated methods for investigating crimes involving international suspects, and immigrant communities learned to balance their natural solidarity with necessary caution about the backgrounds and intentions of those seeking their assistance. Today, as we examine these dark chapters from America's past, we are reminded that the challenge of distinguishing between genuine refugees seeking better lives and predators seeking new hunting grounds remains as relevant now as it was in the 19th century. The cases we have explored today serve as sobering reminders that evil can speak any language, claim any nationality, and exploit any form of human sympathy or solidarity in pursuit of its goals. The American experiment in creating a society that welcomes people from all backgrounds and traditions continues to face the fundamental challenge of maintaining openness and generosity while protecting innocent people from those who would abuse that generosity. These historical cases remind us that the price of maintaining our values is eternal vigilance against those who would use our virtues as weapons against us. Thank you for joining me today as we explored these disturbing chapters from 19th century American criminal history. I hope you found this examination both informative and thought-provoking, and I encourage you to share your thoughts and reactions. I look forward to bringing you more compelling historical cases in future episodes.